The voices drifted from the kitchen, low at first, then sharp enough to cut through the hum of the refrigerator. I paused in the hallway, one hand still resting on the frame of the doorway. That fat woman disgusts me. I'm only interested in her money, Ethan said, his tone casual, like he was commenting on the weather. Sienna's laugh was soft but full of agreement. Well, as long as you keep her happy, we'll get what we need. They didn't know I was there. They didn't know I had stopped breathing for fear that the sound of it would give me away. I'd carried those words in my chest before the rest of my body even registered the sting. My feet stayed rooted, but my mind raced back over 32 years of scraped knees, parent-teacher conferences, and nights when I worked 2 shifts so he wouldn't have to go without. I eased away from the doorway, careful not to make the floorboards creak. In the guest bathroom, I gripped the counter until my knuckles ached. My face in the mirror was the same one that had smiled at his high school graduation, stood proudly at his wedding, and signed the deed that gave him a home to visit whenever he wanted. Now it looked like a stranger's tight around the mouth, eyes dull with something that was not just hurt, but understanding. By the time evening came, I had folded those words into the deepest part of me. I set the table, poured the wine, and brought out the roast I had seasoned the night before. Ethan complimented the food with the kind of automatic politeness he had learned as a boy. Sienna chatted about a weekend trip, her bracelets clinking against the stem of her glass. I smiled when they looked my way. I laughed when the timing called for it. I even passed the dessert with a practiced grace, but inside, something had shifted quietly, irreversibly. And as I cleared the plates, I knew I would not be here much longer. After they left that night, I sat alone at the dining table, running my fingertips over the grain of the wood. That table had been here since the first week we moved into the Charleston house, when Ethan was still a toddler and the rooms echoed with more space than we knew how to fill. I had been 24, newly widowed, and terrified. The house was part of my late husband's family estate, a gift from his parents, who said they wanted Ethan to grow up with stability. What they didn't say was that upkeep on a property worth over $1 million could eat through a young widow's savings like fire through dry grass. So I worked, days in the administrative office at the port, nights at a diner, refilling coffee for men who never looked me in the eye. I learned to live on one real meal a day, saving the rest for Ethan's lunchbox. I sold my wedding ring when the tuition bill for his first semester at the university came due. It was the only thing I had left that was purely mine, but I didn't think twice. There were winters when the heating bill nearly broke me, and summers when the AC went out for weeks. Still, I kept the garden trimmed, the shutters painted, the piano tuned. Every corner of the house held some piece of Ethan's life finger paintings from kindergarten, team photos, the suit he wore to prom. Over the years, there were moments when selling crossed my mind, downsizing to something manageable, using the money to travel or retire early. But each time, I'd see him on the porch at Thanksgiving or carrying gifts in at Christmas, and I told myself this house was part of his inheritance. Now, sitting in its quiet heart, I realized I had built this place for him as much as for myself, and for the first time. The walls felt less like protection and more like a cage. The next morning, I walked through each room with a different set of eyes. The next evening, I set the table for 4. Ethan, Sienna, and a mutual friend of theirs were coming for his birthday. I'd baked the cake myself, chocolate with a raspberry filling, his favorite since he was 12. The candles were already in place, though I couldn't recall the last time they'd actually meant something to him when they arrived. Sienna swept in first, her perfume trailing behind her like an announcement. "Oh, you still have that old sideboard," she said with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. Vintage is charming. When it's intentional? Ethan laughed lightly, the sound more like agreement than correction. I pretended not to notice. We sat down, and I served the roast. Sienna picked at her plate, making a show of pushing the potatoes aside. I started this cleanse last week, she said. You should try it. Lorinda, it's amazing for trimming stubborn weight. She reached for her wine, her glance flicking to Ethan as if to share some private joke. Ethan said nothing in my defense, only asked for more gravy. I smiled and poured it. My hands steady. My mind was far from the conversation, already mapping out a silent to-do list. Call the realtor. Find a private buyer. Arrange the transfer. Keep quiet until every piece is in place. The friend complimented the meal, and I thanked him warmly. I laughed at the right moments, asked about their plans for the weekend, and passed the breadbasket when it was needed. No one could have guessed that while I sat there. I was dismantling my life in my head, brick by brick, when the cake came out. Ethan blew out the candles with a single breath. We clinked glasses. Sienna took a photo for social media, tilting her phone to capture the chandelier overhead. I held my glass a little higher, meeting Ethan's eyes across the table. If he noticed anything different in my expression, he didn't say. After they left, I cleared the plates in silence, the checklist now fully formed by the time I stacked the last dish. I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I slipped out of bed, trading my slippers for bare feet, letting them sink into the cool wood floors. The air felt different tonight, thick with the weight of decisions I'd never dared to make before. I moved from room to room, touching the life I had built with my own hands. The dining chairs I'd reupholstered after a flood ruined the originals. The sideboard Sienna had mocked, which I had stripped and stained one summer when Ethan was away at camp. My fingers lingered on the piano my husband bought just months before he died. Neither of us ever learned to play, but he had liked the way it filled the parlor, as if its presence alone could promise music someday. In the hallway, I stopped at the wall of photographs. Ethan in overalls, chasing bubbles in the backyard, his first day of school, backpack too big for his small shoulders. Him on the university steps, diploma in hand, every frame a reminder of years I had given without hesitation, expecting nothing but respect in return. On the desk in the study, I pulled out a sheet of heavy stationery and uncapped my pen. The words came quickly, steady as my heartbeat. Thank you for showing me your soul. I folded it once, slid it into an envelope, and left it on the center of the desk. No name, no explanation. Then I picked up the phone and scrolled to a number I'd kept for years but never used. The realtor answered groggily, but when I said my name and told him what I wanted, his voice sharpened. A private buyer, cash ready, no public listing. He could arrange it within 24 hours. I agreed without hesitation. By the time the call ended, the sky outside had begun to pale. I stood at the window, watching the first light bleed across the lawn. The magnolia tree swayed gently, and for a moment, I thought of all the mornings I'd stood in this exact spot, coffee in hand, believing I'd grow old here. Now, I knew the next sunrise I saw would not be from this window. The sale went through faster than even I'd imagined. By the second evening, the papers were signed, the keys surrendered, and the funds wired to an account under a trust name in another state. It was clean, final, and entirely mine. I left before dawn, carrying a single suitcase and the leather satchel that had traveled with me since my first job interview decades ago. My phone stayed switched off in the bottom of the bag, a dead weight I had no intention of reviving. At the bus station, I bought a ticket to the first small town on the schedule that didn't sound familiar, Maple Hollow. The ride was long and quiet, broken only by the soft hum of the tires and the occasional shuffle of another passenger. I watched the landscape change through the window. Coastal flatlands giving way to rolling fields, then clusters of modest houses and storefronts that looked untouched by time. Maple Hollow's bus depot was a narrow strip of linoleum and mismatched chairs. By noon, I had found a listing for a furnished one-bedroom above a bakery. The landlord, a wiry man with paint-speckled hands, didn't ask many questions. I told him my name was Lena Cross. He slid the keys across the counter without hesitation after I paid the first month in cash. The apartment was small but clean. A sofa that had seen better days, a bed with a quilt stitched in uneven squares, a window that overlooked the alley behind the bakery. It was nothing like Charleston, and that was exactly the point. 2 days later, I walked past a brick building with a hand-painted sign, Maple Hollow Community Food Pantry. A woman was unloading boxes from the back of an old van, her face flushed from the heat. I offered to help. And by the end of the afternoon, I'd been shown how to stack canned goods, log donations, and greet visitors with warmth but not pity. By the time I returned to my apartment, my arms ached from lifting, but it was the good kind of ache, one that came from doing something useful. The quiet that night was different from the one I'd left behind. This one didn't feel like absence. It felt like space. Marjorie Holt was the kind of woman who could make a pot of soup stretch for 3 days and still offer you the last bowl. We met one afternoon at the pantry when a box of produce split open at her feet. Potatoes rolling across the floor. I bent to help, and she laughed, shaking her head as if to say life had been scattering her groceries for years. Her daughter, Clara, started coming along after school, 9 years old, with a tangle of chestnut hair and a shy smile. She'd sit at a corner table with her math worksheets while her mother sorted donations. I found myself drifting over, checking her work, showing her little tricks to make long division easier. It began with helping Clara on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Then Marjorie invited me over for dinner on a Friday night meatloaf. Mashed potatoes and green beans from a neighbor's garden. We ate at her kitchen table, the 3 of us leaning in over chipped plates as if we'd been doing it for years. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so at ease in someone else's home. Soon, we were trading meals, my chicken stew for her peach cobbler, my lasagna for her cornbread. Clara started slipping her hand into mine when we walked from the pantry to the bakery. I told myself it was harmless, just a kindness between new friends. Still, there was something in the way Marjorie looked at me sometimes, as if she sensed the hollow spaces I kept carefully hidden. One afternoon, while I was stacking canned beans onto a shelf, 2 volunteers at the front desk began talking in low voices. I caught a fragment, looks just like her, missing person's sight. Charleston. I kept my back turned, my hands moving steadily, but the sound of my own heartbeat drowned out their words. When I passed the front desk later, they smiled at me like nothing had been said. I smiled back. But the air felt different now, charged, fragile. That night in my apartment, I double-checked the locks. Even though Maple Hollow was the kind of town where people left their doors open, lying in bed, I thought of Clara's small hand in mine and wondered how much longer I could keep Lena Cross separate from Lorinda Calloway. It was a Thursday morning at the pantry, the kind where the hours slip by in a rhythm of opening boxes, stacking shelves, and greeting a steady stream of visitors. I was in the back room, sorting bags of rice, when the sound of tires crunching over gravel drew my eyes to the side window. A black SUV idled at the curb, dark-tinted windows, engine running. It didn't belong here. Most people came on foot or in beat-up sedans. My stomach tightened. I moved closer to the doorway, staying out of sight. Just enough to see the driver's profile through the windshield. The angle was quick. Imperfect, but it was enough. Ethan's jawline. My breath caught. I stepped back, letting the heavy door to the alley swing open just wide enough for me to slip through. The cold air hit my face as I crossed behind the building, weaving between stacked pallets and recycling bins until I reached the narrow lane that emptied onto the next street. I didn't look back. By the time I returned through the front entrance, the SUV was gone. My hands felt unsteady as I wiped them on my apron, but I forced my voice to sound even when Marjorie came over with a box of pasta for me to shelve. "You okay? You look a little pale," she said, tilting her head. "Just skipped breakfast," I replied, busying myself with the shelves so I wouldn't have to meet her eyes. She lingered for a moment, her gaze steady on me, but didn't push. We finished the shift without another word about it. Still, the back of my neck prickled the rest of the day, the way it used to when I knew someone was watching me in a crowded room. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the bakery's refrigerator below filling the silence. If Ethan was here, he was closer than I'd ever allowed him to be since I left. And if he'd found Maple Hollow once, he could find it again. The sight of that SUV had settled something in me, not fear exactly, but certainty. I couldn't keep drifting between shifts at the pantry and evenings in my apartment, waiting for the past to decide when to catch me. If I was going to have a life here, it had to be more than hiding. I started walking the side streets of Maple Hollow, looking at storefronts the way other people might look at houses for sale. 2 blocks from the square, I found it a weathered brick building that had once been a hardware store, its windows clouded with dust, the for sale sign tilted in the dirt. Inside, the air smelled of wood and rust, the shelves stripped bare, but the bones were good. The owner was an older man who wanted to be rid of it quickly. I paid in full, under the name Lena Cross, with funds that had been resting in the trust account since I left Charleston. No one in town knew my real name. No one could link the deed to Ethan. That was the point. I made sketches at my kitchen table rooms on the upper floor for temporary housing. The main space downstairs divided into offices for counseling, a small kitchen, and a workshop area for skills training. Legal aid would have a corner too. I wanted women to walk in here and feel, for the first time in a long time, that they weren't alone and they weren't a problem to be solved. Some nights I lay awake thinking about paint colors, furniture placement, the order of renovations. Other nights, I thought about the women I'd seen at the pantry, tired, guarded, but still carrying themselves with a stubborn kind of hope. By the end of the month, the keys were mine. I stood in the middle of that empty space, my footsteps echoing off the walls, and for the first time since I left, I felt like I was building something that couldn't be taken from me. I was standing by the front window of the old hardware store, measuring the frame for new glass, when a shadow fell across the doorway. Ethan. He didn't bother with a greeting. "So this is where you've been hiding," he said, stepping inside like he owned the air between us. "Do you have any idea how this looks? You disappear, sell the house, and start this. You're embarrassing the family." I set the tape measure down. "The family?" I asked quietly. "Or you?" His jaw tightened. "You need to transfer the money back. We have plans. Investments." "No," I said. "I raised you to be better than this. I won't finance the man you've chosen to be." The silence that followed was heavy. The kind that comes when 2 people realize they no longer speak the same language. I walked to the desk and picked up a small envelope I had prepared weeks ago. Though I hadn't expected to hand it over so soon, I placed it in his hand. "That's all I have left to give you." He glanced down, tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 7 words. "Dignity is worth more than inheritance." His eyes flicked up, searching mine for some hint of hesitation. There was none, without another word. He turned and walked out, the sound of the door closing behind him sharper than any slam. I stood still until the echo faded, then went back to the window, picked up the tape measure, and marked the next line. The refuge opened on a mild spring morning, sunlight spilling through the freshly cleaned windows and the scent of new paint still lingering in the air. We kept the ribbon-cutting small no press. No speeches, just the women who had helped scrub. Sand and paint every corner of the place. Marjorie stood beside me, her hair pulled back and a clipboard in hand, already stepping into her role as co-director. Clara darted between the rooms, showing visitors where the kitchen was, where the play area had been set up. Her voice bright with pride. At one point, she stopped, wrapped her arms around my waist, and said, "You're my second mom now." I held her a moment longer than she expected. The day passed in a blur of handshakes, hugs, and the low hum of voices filling spaces that had once been silent. I watched women walk in carrying more weight than their arms should have to bear bags. Children, fear and leave a little lighter, if only for an afternoon. Later, when the last guest had gone and the lights inside were dim, I carried a sapling out to the patch of soil by the back fence. The young oak was no taller than my shoulder, its leaves trembling in the breeze. I knelt, pressing my hands into the dirt, feeling its cool weight against my skin as I planted it deep. The roots would take time to settle, to anchor themselves. So would I. I stood, brushing soil from my palms, and looked at the sturdy little trunk, already leaning toward the sun. For the first time in a long while, I knew exactly where I belonged,